Welcome to our study this week of Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 18. My name is Scott Rainey. I serve with the Church of the Nazarene in the area of Nazarene Discipleship International, or NDI. This adult Sunday school video lesson is provided in collaboration between the Foundry Publishing and NDI. The Sunday school lesson is intended to support the local church's efforts to make disciples who make disciples. Please feel free to use this video in any way that helps your church and its families. Today, we continue our study of the ministry of the Apostle Paul through the book of Acts. Last week, we discovered through Acts chapter 16, verses 16 to 34, that Jesus had power to free us from any chains that are binding us. According to Acts chapter 17, after Paul and Silas' time in a prison in Philippi, they shared the good news in cities like Thessalonica, Berea, and Athens. In each place, in each new city, Paul seemed to discover the same things. Some people were open to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Others rejected Paul and his ministry team, and thus rejected the truth of God in Christ. In many of these cities, the rejection of the gospel meant persecution in the life of Paul and his companions. After Paul's time in Athens, he traveled to the city of Corinth. The history of Corinth dates back to perhaps as early as 3500 BC. At the height of the Greek Empire from 776 BC to 323 BC, Corinth became a great city, eclipsing even Athens in prominence. The primary reason for the importance of the city was its strategic location. The ancient city of Corinth was located on a narrow strip of land called an isthmus that separated two bodies of water. The city possessed a harbor on each side of the narrow isthmus that gave it access to both the Adriatic Sea on the west and the Aegean Sea on the east. Because of this location and access, the city naturally became the main travel route between Rome on the west and the major cities and land to the east. In ancient days, cargo and passengers had to disembark on one side of the isthmus, traverse the narrow piece of land to the other side, about 4 miles, where they would then get on another boat and resume the journey by sea. Today, there is a water canal that connects these two harbors, making it much easier for goods and passengers to travel from the west to the east and vice versa. In 146 BC, the dominant Roman Empire destroyed the ancient Greek city of Corinth. About 100 years later, in 44 BC, Julius Caesar rebuilt the city of Corinth. By the time the Apostle Paul arrived in Corinth, as described in Acts 18, probably around AD 50, Corinth was a major Roman city, the capital of the province of Achaia, with approximately 100,000 inhabitants. Not unlike our mega cities today, Corinth had great wealth, dynamic culture, and abundant entertainment. It was a religious and philosophical center. At the same time, the city was known for its immorality. Overlooking the city was a large hill where there was a temple of Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of sexual love and beauty. According to one ancient historian, the temple housed 1,000 prostitutes, which he said made Corinth a popular and decadent tourist attraction during Paul's day. This reality gave birth to a new verb in the day of Paul. To Corinthianize meant to live in immorality and debauchery. The city's prosperity and growth in population made it a logical location for ministry. With that background, let's begin reading Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 18. That's Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 18. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath, he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. But when they opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes and in protest and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent of it. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." Then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. Crispus, the synagogue leader, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized. One night, the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. "Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in this city." So Paul stayed in Corinth for a year and a half, teaching them the word of God. While Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews of Corinth made a united attack on Paul and brought him to the place of judgment. This man, they charged, is persuading the people to worship God in ways that are contrary to the law. Just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to them, "If you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanor or serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to listen to you. But since it involves questions about words and names and your own law, settle the matter yourselves. I will not be a judge of such things." So he threw them off. He drove them off. Then the crowd there turned on Sosthenes, the synagogue leader, and beat him in front of the proconsul, and Gallio showed no concern whatsoever. Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. Then he left the brothers and sisters and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. Before he sailed, he had his hair cut off at Cenchrea because of a vow he had taken. When the Apostle Paul arrived in Corinth, we learn in Acts chapter 18, verse 2, that he met a Christian couple named Aquila and Priscilla. The Bible does not record when and how this Jewish couple became Christians, but their presence in Corinth and partnership with Paul became very important. Verse 2 reveals that Aquila was a native of Pontus, a region on the southern coast of the Black Sea in modern-day Turkey. Aquila and Priscilla, however, were Jews who lived at that time in Italy and who had come to faith in Jesus Christ before traveling, it appears, to Corinth. The reason for their move to Corinth was an edict by the Roman Emperor Claudius in AD 49. History tells us that there began to be a disturbance among the Jewish population in Rome. According to one 2nd century biographer, Suetonius, the disturbance in Rome among the Jewish community was associated with Christus, which may have well been a misspelled reference to Christus, which is Latin for Christ. This expulsion of Jews from Rome may have been in response to a serious dispute within Jewish circles over early Christian teachings. The fact that Aquila and Priscilla were among the expelled may mean that it was the Jews who believed Jesus was the Messiah who were kicked out of Rome. While government opposition caused Aquila and Priscilla to be banned from their home in Rome, God used this exiled Christian couple to spread the gospel message throughout the Roman Empire. Let me just mention a modern day similarity to this situation in Acts chapter 18. Most Christian leaders today recognize that the Christian church in Ukraine has been the most mission-minded church throughout Eastern Europe. For example, there are more missionaries from Ukraine serving in other Eastern European countries than any other country in Eastern Europe. When Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, millions of Ukrainians were dispersed throughout Europe by the actions of the Russian government. Many of these refugees are believing Christians. Some of them even are Nazarenes. After many weeks of tears and heartbreak over what had happened, I remember the Lord giving me a new thought as I prayed for Ukraine. How would Jesus take what man meant for evil and make good of it? How would hundreds of thousands of displaced Ukrainian Christians begin to be used as missionaries in new countries throughout all of Europe and indeed around the world? This is a scenario that Aquila and Priscilla experienced at the hand of the Roman government, and that Ukrainian Christians now experience at the hand of the Russian government. Aquila and Priscilla seemed to not miss a beat. They began to evangelize their new home in Corinth. I am praying that Ukrainian Christians will receive God's peace and his call to share the good news with the world through this terrible experience that a government has thrust upon them. Aquila and Priscilla shared a number of things in common with the Apostle Paul. They were Jewish. They were believers. They shared a common trade, tent making or leatherworking. It was common for tradespersons to live and to work together. Aquila and Priscilla showed hospitality toward Paul by allowing him to stay and work with them, according to verse 3 of Acts chapter 18, a sign of Christian discipleship. In church planting, this couple became what we call people of peace in a new area of ministry. Let me pause here again and simply mention that the Apostle Paul may have been the first bivocational pastor while he preached in Corinth. There are many pastors today who work bivocationally as they obediently answer God's call to preach the gospel. This isn't an easy task, working all week in a secular job while faithfully serving Jesus and his church week in and week out. These hardworking pastors are literally following in the footsteps of the Apostle Paul. If you're a layperson and have a pastor who's bivocational, take a moment this week to share your appreciation for all they do. Be sure to come alongside your pastor, showing Christian hospitality like Aquila and Priscilla. Working during the week, Paul shared the gospel message every Sabbath in the synagogue as usual, or as was his custom, according to Acts chapter 14, verse 1. Acts 18, verse 4 says that Paul reasoned or debated with those who were present in the synagogue. He also tried to persuade or convince others that Jesus was the Messiah. I've heard some people shy away from this kind of persuasion in sharing their faith. We're not speaking about arguing with somebody. Reasoning with and persuading others, however, is a part of sharing the gospel. Reasoning and persuasion has the concept of continual conversations and persistence through friendship. Some people might have real or legitimate roadblocks to faith. If given the right chance to ask questions in a non-threatening environment with a Christian friend, non-believers might receive answers to their faith barriers and find themselves kneeling at the foot of the cross in new faith. In Acts chapter 18, verse 5, we learn that Silas and Timothy arrive in Corinth to continue to serve alongside Paul. They had been left behind in Berea, according to Acts chapter 17, verse 14, when Paul had to escape the persecution from the Jews. Now they had found Paul again and are once again by his side in ministry. The arrival of Silas and Timothy probably encouraged and emboldened Paul with fresh energy and concentration to share the gospel. It's possible that they had even brought money to help the ministry. Whatever happened, we see that with the presence of Silas and Timothy, Paul becomes laser focused and is now able to devote himself to preaching and testifying that Jesus is the Messiah. We should not underestimate the powerful importance of our encouragement and support for pastors and leaders in the church. Our support, both moral support and financial support, can make a significant difference, as did Paul and Saul, Silas, and Timothy's, in our pastors' effectiveness. Even still, some opposed Paul and became abusive, according to Acts 18, verse 6. The Greek word translated become abusive is literally blasphemous. By using the word blasphemous, Luke, the author of Acts, insinuated that opposition was not only against Paul, but against God himself. Paul then declared that he was turning his attention away from persuading the Jews to focusing on the Gentiles. So Paul leaves the synagogue, but he doesn't go far. In fact, he literally goes next door to the home of Titius Justus, who was a Greek worshiper of God. We learn in verse 8 that Crispus, the synagogue leader, his entire household, and many others came to faith during this evangelistic outreach of Paul. For Crispus, the synagogue leader, to come to faith would have been a notable occurrence because Jewish religious leaders were usually against those who followed Jesus. Being a prominent figure in the Jewish community, he would have undoubtedly had influence on others coming to faith as well. Paul had been through this before. Opposition to the message of Christ had driven him from cities where he had preached and even had him beaten and thrown in prison. I can imagine Paul was concerned and wondering if he would once again be kicked out of the city where he was staying. In a nighttime vision, the Lord told Paul to put aside his fear, literally in Greek, do not continue to fear. The Lord's instruction was threefold. Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent. Acts chapter 18, verse 9. In addition, the Lord promised his presence and protection over Paul. Paul obeys this revelation from Jesus, and we learn in verse 11 that he remains in Corinth for an additional 18 months. Here's the bottom line. Despite opposition, believers can rest confidently in God's ability to accomplish his plans and to protect his children. That promise of God, however, didn't and doesn't mean smooth sailing all the time. The promise was for God's presence and protection. Difficult times did in fact and do in fact come. Due to the increase of many destructive new religions throughout the empire, the Roman government had declared all new religions to be illegal and punishable by law. Jews in Corinth, therefore, brought a case against Paul to Gallio, the proconsul in Roman official with legal jurisdiction over Achaia. Here was their claim. First, Paul was misleading citizens of Corinth to worship God in ways not covered by the synagogue, since he was not meeting there. This accusation seemed to be a religious charge against Paul, creating a new religion, if you will. They said Paul was teaching that his teaching was contrary to the law, verse 13. The Greek can also translate this phrase that his teaching was beside the law, which literally describes the new location where Paul served, beside the synagogue. Second, Paul's preaching was undermining the social stability of the city and the empire. This would be more of a legal accusation against Paul. This significant legal challenge should not be quickly passed by. If the Jews could persuade Gallio to rule against Paul's preaching, the legal protection established in Corinth would have effectively banned the Christian faith throughout the Roman Empire early in its beginning. This was a big moment. Before Paul could even bring his argument, Gallio dismissed the case, the entire case. Gallio contended that the charges did not involve Roman law. He understood the controversy as theological and wanted no part of the debate. God had handed Paul and the early church a significant victory over opposition. In 2011, I was serving as the pastor of Houston Living Word Church of the Nazarene. I had been there for over 8 years. Our church was unique in that we were blessed to have several influential veterans of foreign wars who regularly attended our church. A few of these members served on the council that planned for the yearly Memorial Day celebration at the Houston National Cemetery. For 3 consecutive years, these leaders in my church had asked me to be the guest pastor on the platform of the celebration to pray for our nation and its families. It was a great honor to do this, praying before up to 5,000 citizens of Houston on such a special day of remembrance. In the spring of 2011, I received an email from the director of the Houston National Cemetery, an employee of the Veterans Administration of the United States government. She was new to her role and asked me to write out my intended prayer to submit to her for approval. It was a strange request to me. I knew it was significant. I prayed for God's wisdom, wrote a prayer, and emailed her back. Within 10 minutes, I received a return email from her stating that my prayer was unacceptable because I was praying in Jesus' name. To make a long story short, a Christian organization of lawyers contacted me and asked me to allow them to represent me in filing a restraining order that would allow me to pray whatever I wanted to pray on Memorial Day. I knew this was a significant moment for freedom against opposition to the church. The Lord gave us the right judge in Houston that next morning. He quickly chided the Veterans Administration for trying to dictate how someone would pray in America. In the end, the Veterans Administration agreed to a list of 52 changes that they would make at the Houston National Cemetery to give freedom to people of faith. This included the changing of 2 executive orders by 2 different presidents. There are moments, like Paul had in Corinth, where God gives great victory to provide freedom for his people to worship and proclaim his name. God said to Paul, "Do not be afraid. Keep speaking. Do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you because I have many people in this city."